Greetings and welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. For about 30 years, I've been studying UFO reports, and I've never stopped reading them. And to this day, they continue to astonish me. The things that these objects are able to do, the sheer quantity of them, the fact that they're all over the world, the fact that most people don't have the slightest idea of how to respond when they see them or even know how to talk about their experience after the fact, sometimes for many years, sometimes forever. I mean, all of that continues to astonish me, frankly. And then the implications of what all this represents. Something even now, even after all these years, the UFO research community still really doesn't discuss almost ever the implications of what all this activity means. No, they don't. So all of that is interesting. Still, what probably has always interested me the most, if I had to pick one element of the UFO subject that I just can't help but keep coming back to, it's military encounters with UFOs. It was a thing that first got my attention in the early 1990s, a long, long time ago. It was a thing that made me realize that there was a real UFO cover-up. It was something, these military cases, that at least sometimes left a paper trail that proved that the phenomenon actually was real. At least it did to me, and that it was considered very important to high-ranking defense and intelligence officials. So studying all of that, especially several decades ago when practically no one talked about UFOs in public, that was kind of shocking to me. It was the most blatant example of hypocrisy and lying that I could identify relating to the UFO subject. In fact, I would say it was perhaps the most blatant example of lying in general coming from the United States government that I could think of in relating to anything. I think UFOs were right around at the front of the line there in terms of deception. So I do believe it's why I've never been able to pull myself away from this subject. All UFO encounters are important, all of them. They all matter. But I still believe that the military encounters are special for a couple of reasons. I got some slides here I'll just show you. You don't need to see me here. Why? So, well, one reason is that the military is charged with defending national security. That's obvious. That's one thing that makes these things important. Another thing is that the military is part of the United States government. In other words, in theory, they work for us. And so if the United States military is encountering a UFO phenomenon, that's like, those are our guys, and you're a citizen of the United States. That means they're your employees in that sense. The military is here to serve the citizens. Never forget that. Another reason why the military matters is that they've got a lot of weapons. They carry and use dangerous weapons, including nuclear ordnance at times. And so when they're having an encounter with an unidentified object that is doing something that is inexplicable and is engaging with military personnel, there is always the threat of something dangerous happening. So that is important. Another reason is that, at least in some instances, the military, in fact, it's usually supposed to leave a paper trail regarding its activities, and therefore some level of evidence, and we might even say proof of the reality of UFOs. And that, in fact, might be the single important thing that really first got my attention. It's like, there's evidence here that we can look at. Another reason is that studying military UFO encounters can give us an idea of how the government perceives the UFO reality and whether or not they're telling us the truth when it comes to their policy on UFOs. In other words, it gives us insights into the secrecy apparatus of our system. And I think that's important. And then I have another reason here, is simply that the U.S. military is, all militaries, but I'm looking specifically here at the United States military, and it is one of the primary symbols of national power that we have. And if they are encountering UFO phenomenon and they are unable to deal with that phenomenon, well, that's something kind of important. I'm sure there are other reasons why military UFO encounters will matter. You could probably think of a few yourself, but I think these are enough to make the point that military UFO encounters are important. They are worthy of their own special focus and their own special study. And I would say, moreover, in an era when now the Pentagon has clearly told the Senate and the public that there is, quote, no credible evidence thus far of extraterrestrial activity, off-world technology, or objects that defy the known laws of physics. You get that, I imagine most of us will grant that the national security community has the right to some legitimate secrets. I'm not saying they don't. Presumably, however, under responsible civilian oversight in some manner, okay, they've got, responsible civilian oversight, which, let's face it, we have not really had on so many levels in such a long time in this nation. But at least we can grant that in theory, there are some legitimate areas where secrecy can be said to be necessary. Secrecy with oversight. Okay, fine. But even if you grant that in the case of UFOs or UAP, let me ask you a question. How many years should this be kept secret? Because we're now at the 80-year mark at a minimum. That's a full human lifetime, about 3 or 4 generations there. Shall we go for another lifetime, another 3 or 4 generations? People don't always know when they're being lied to, but sometimes we do. Sometimes we know when we're being lied to, and I think it's fair to say this is one of those times. Now, I have 3 UFO cases that I'm going to present to you, all involving the United States military, and specifically these involve the United States Navy. You probably don't know about these cases. 2 of them have gotten a little bit of attention over the years, very limited, so they're effectively buried. And the 3rd one, I don't think has gotten really any attention. It was posted over a decade ago. I don't think anyone's really discussed it ever. So these are 3 utterly buried U.S. Navy UFO encounters for all intents and purposes. Now, the problem with these military cases is that they are not part of the official records that we have on UFOs. There's probably a paper trail on some of them. As you will see, there definitely would be a paper trail on probably some of these. But good luck getting access to any of them at this point. So when people like Sean Fitzpatrick who I just showed an image of earlier, of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, that's AARO, when he's speaking to the Senate, which he did last week, he talked several times about the need for data integrity. And I would say, yes, we all want data integrity, but the fact is, A, this is a phenomenon that doesn't always play by the rules that we would like it to play by. B, there is genuine and deep secrecy within the military about UFOs or UAP. And C, as a result, many of the most compelling accounts that we get have come to us many years later by a witness, usually under conditions of anonymity. So where's the data integrity there? Are we then just obligated to ignore these many stories and claims that come out every year? They come out every year. There are new such stories as what I'm about to share with you. They are nearly always told by older, aging veterans who've got nothing to gain by telling these stories. And they're not trying to gain anything. They're just tired of living under secrecy, living under a lie. Well, I think we need to listen to these stories. At least listen. You can decide if you believe them or not, but I will point out that although we don't have a direct UFO paper trail on them, we do have a paper trail on many other military UFO encounters that are also quite extraordinary. I've talked about a lot of those many, many times. In other words, what I am going to share with you here is very much in line with those many reports. The ones I'm about to share with you, I happen to believe the truth of the fundamentals, and that is why I'm sharing them with you here. You can decide for yourself. So let us Continue, and there we go. This first one will deal with the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt. That's an aircraft carrier nicknamed Rosie. And this, we now believe, took place in 1954. I would say early 1954. And I'll get into the reasons why in a moment. But, even declassified UFO military reports are usually incomplete in some way or another. And they're always missing pieces of the story. And when you get stories told after the fact many years later, there's going to be missing pieces. And that happens here as well. So let's go into it. This is a leaked account that came out about a number of years after the fact. So we're told this was 1954. And the reason is that the person writing the account in, let me take this off here, did not give the year. He was being very, very careful. But the late USO researcher, Carl Feit, who looked into this case, he apparently found this one listed in the MUFON case management system, the CMS. Otherwise, public information about it does not list a year. So let me just show you. This is a map of where the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt was in the beginning of 1954. Normally, the Rosie was deployed in the Mediterranean Sea, but on January 7, 1954, it sailed for Puget Sound. That's on the U.S. Northwest coast. I've got that listed on the map there. It had to undergo a major refitting, reconstruction, and that was actually, that lasted several years. Now, because the Roosevelt was too large to pass through the Panama Canal, it was forced to sail around South America's Cape Horn. So in other words, in early 1954, the Roosevelt was in the Mediterranean Sea. It was in the North Atlantic Ocean. It was in the South Atlantic Ocean. It was in the South Pacific Ocean. It was in the North Pacific Ocean. It was pretty much everywhere. You're talking about 20,000 miles of where this thing could have been. And the person describing the encounter did not describe specifically where it took place. What he did say is, although I would like to divulge detailed information to you, I must first think of my family. Now, this man did state, however, that he was an officer on the Roosevelt. He wasn't just a regular enlisted guy. He was an officer, and he witnessed the events that I'm going to describe to you. This is what he writes here. Without stating my position, I will state that we attempted, he writes in very military terminology here, by the way. I will state that we attempted to engage the craft with weaponry. We attempted to engage the craft with weaponry. And in the 10 minutes of viewing and the 4 minutes of this attempt, you notice how exact he is here, the weapons would not allow themselves to be prepared for engagement. He said, we also attempted to prepare the launch of aircraft at the conclusion of the event. I was informed of the object when it arrived by a fellow officer who engaged me in conversation concerning the proper procedure in detailing with this type of event. Now, that's interesting. So up to this point, he didn't describe the exact object that he was looking at, but he does describe it later. And this is my recreation of what he's describing. And he essentially stated that this was a cigar-shaped object. His estimate and his colleague's estimate, I think they both believe this is about 100 feet long. And I don't know if this was the correct color, but I think it was daytime, and it probably did not look all that dissimilar from what you've got here. So up to this point, we're dealing with a U.S. Navy encounter with an airborne UFO. And this part, the part you're looking at here, hovering or close to the Rosie, this is interesting enough, but it gets a little more interesting. So he continues. Let me move on to his statement. He says, at the 14-minute mark, the craft rapidly traveled upward as two small round objects exited the water. They emerged from the water. That's these two objects here. I don't know if they were white as I depicted them. He didn't say what color they were. They might have been metallic gray. They might have been something else. I don't know. And then he goes on. He states, at the 21-minute mark, a much larger cigar arrived from directly above the FDR, and the two smaller discs entered the cigar. This scenario continued for about 2 minutes, and then he says, and then the cigar once again departed upward at 23 minutes roughly. And 3 minutes later, he says, at the 26-minute mark, the cigar returned and dove into the water, which you're seeing here. So that's what he had to say. So this account, that was submitted to Filer's Files. That's run by retired U.S. Air Force Major George Filer. He's put that out for many, many years. I'm not sure if it's gone to any other sources. I think it has, but Filer's Files is where I found this a number of years ago. So obviously we have to recognize the limitations of blindly accepting an anonymous encounter submitted many years after the fact. Yes, of course, but recognizing the intense secrecy that has always surrounded the UFO subject, we can't be surprised that stories like this eventually filter out to the rest of the world. I've spoken confidentially to quite a few military UFO witnesses myself, including a number of U.S. Navy personnel who, by the way, in my opinion, give the most dramatic UFO stories that I have ever heard in the military with regularity. But anyway, I've spoken to a lot of these people, and it's abundantly clear to me that many of these stories circulate quietly throughout the militaries of the world, undoubtedly. But it should just be just as obvious that the United States military, which has such an active global reach and has for so many years, of course, the United States military is going to have many of these stories. So let me continue on with this account a little bit. Let's just comment on some of the specific facts mentioned by the author. So one of the things he mentions is that we attempted to engage the craft with weaponry, and in the 10 minutes of viewing and the 4 minutes of this attempt, the weapons would not allow themselves to be prepared for engagement. So you just stop and think about that. The United States Navy was trying to shoot this object down. That's interesting enough. Even more interesting is that it seems to have disabled the weaponry on this aircraft carrier. How was this done? How would the weapons not allow themselves to be prepared for engagement, as he put it? Moreover, 10 minutes of viewing, that's a pretty long time to observe this object, which he identified as being cigar-shaped and 100 feet long, the first one. And then 4 additional minutes of trying to shoot at it. I just think that is quite remarkable. And then the next point, this object acted in an intelligent fashion by rapidly traveling upward and apparently leaving the area. I'm talking about the first cigar-shaped object here. That's the last we hear of this craft. At the same time, he says 2 small round objects exited the water. Now, that's interesting as well. We're talking about a coordinated grouping of UFO or USO craft. The larger cigar-shaped object that comes in, presumably that was engaged in an activity with the smaller craft, the 2 smaller craft that had been in the water. And it makes me just wonder, was the Roosevelt simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or were these objects tracking the Roosevelt? You know, it's hard to know. The fact that 2 objects were seen exiting the water, that seems extraordinary, and it is extraordinary. But let's keep in mind that this is not a unique claim, not in the 1950s and not in later years either. These smaller craft were estimated to be 50 feet in diameter each. It's a pretty significant size. And I would just point out, he originally described them as round, but he later described them as discs. So take that how you will. And then the last point that I just wanted to make about this is that he emphasizes that 7 minutes after the discs left the water, a much larger cigar-shaped craft arrived into the area, which he estimated to be 300 feet in diameter. It's pretty big. It's very large. then the two discs entered this large craft, and it initially traveled away from the Roosevelt. However, it soon returned and entered the water. And you have to wonder what exactly was going on here. But it's not difficult to imagine that the Roosevelt was maybe passing by the location of an undersea area of activity. Maybe just coincidence, maybe a base. Why is that such an outrageous thing to consider, that there could be an undersea base? This has been speculated by many researchers for decades and decades. And it's obvious why. We don't know where this location was. It could have been anywhere along the lines of that route that I showed you earlier, but I have wondered if this took place near the southern part of South America, on the Atlantic side, off the Argentine coast. And I only think that, or I wonder that, just because I have now personally encountered quite a few water-based UFO events in that area. On the other hand, it has to be said, this phenomenon has occurred everywhere in all the major bodies of water of this planet. North Atlantic, South Atlantic, North Pacific, South Pacific. It really could have been anywhere. It could have been off the coast of Baja California as well. Lots of encounters there, including the Tic Tac encounter, which is very famous, but many others. So we don't know where this took place. It's possible that, well, the Roosevelt encountered this one time, but it's possible that you're dealing with multiple undersea bases operating at once. And in fact, that is my own personal assessment at this point. And just as an aside, with this case, I think it's worth mentioning that during this period of time, 1954, the United States was detonating high-yield thermonuclear bombs, that is, hydrogen bombs, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And in 1954, there was one of these projects called Operation Castle, which resulted in very high levels of radiological contamination in places like the Bikini Atoll and another atoll called the Eniwetok Atoll. I'm probably mispronouncing that. But it so happened that on April 4th, 1954, I'm guessing a month or two after the Roosevelt. I think the Roosevelt encounter happened sometime in January of 54, because it really doesn't take a lot more than a month for it to go from where it was stationed to its base in the Northwest. So I'm guessing early part of 54. But anyway, in April of 54, April 7th, a ship called the USS Curtis was part of Operation Castle. And it had just left Bikini Atoll and was heading for Eniwetok Atoll, about 200 miles distant. The Curtis was carrying components of 6 thermonuclear bombs, 6 hydrogen bombs, which actually were assembled on board by the scientific laboratory to be detonated at the 2 atolls. So that was the situation. So it's en route from the one island to the other. It's 11:35 p.m. now. It's late, when an unidentified luminous object passed over the ship from bow to stern, from front to back. It was described as yellowish orange in color. It was traveling at a pretty high rate of speed. Don't know the exact speed, and at a very low altitude. So it was clearly just zipping by the ship, giving it a quick checkout. And again, I think this just demonstrates what surely appears to have been a strong interest by the operators of these craft in the detonation of these, well, extremely dangerous nuclear weapons. Most likely, it gives additional context to some of the other encounters involving the U.S. Navy. And I'm going to go into the next one right now, which actually describes a yellow-orange glowing object. Just so happens. This is the 1971 case of the USS John F. Kennedy. Now, I believe the event here took place where I'm indicating it on this map. The author states that it took place in the Bermuda Triangle, southeast of Florida. I'm guessing that general location's probably about right. This event has some pretty high dramatic value, as you will see. Here's a picture. I think I've got it. Yeah, the carrier itself. That's what it looked like. And the witness wrote about this nearly 30 years after the fact to the National UFO Reporting Center, I think in 2000. So quite some time ago. He was he gave a lot of detail on this, including gave us the exact date, July 2nd, 1971. So he was in the U.S. Navy. He was on this carrier. They were in the Bermuda Triangle. He had been assigned, he said, to the communications department of the Kennedy and had been in the section for about a year, so he knew his job pretty well. He said the ship was returning to Norfolk, Virginia, after completing a 2-week operational readiness exercise, ORE, in the Caribbean. I tried looking this up. So I went into looking at the operational history of the USS John F. Kennedy. It primarily corroborates almost everything that this guy says, by the way. But the entire discussion of this exercise was practically hidden in the official records, the official history that I was able to find online. It seemed a little odd. So the ship was engaged all that summer long in what are called carquals, or carquals, which means carrier qualifications. And this is the process by which pilots are trained and certified to operate aircraft from the decks of aircraft carriers. It's very involved, multiple stages of training and testing to ensure that they're good and proficient at what they're doing. And it takes a while. So according to the history of the USS John F. Kennedy, training continued through June, July, August, and September, all through that period of time. And they mentioned some of the areas where they were, including Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, very close, just south of where this event took place. Did not mention other areas in the Caribbean. It mentioned the Virginia Capes. It mentioned Newport, Rhode Island, Jacksonville, Florida. But it did mention Guantanamo. So when I looked over the whole history here, there were certain things that seemed a little muddy to me in the description. But there was easily enough to make me think this guy who's writing this account, I think he's being accurate here. There was nothing that contradicted anything that he said. I did learn the name of the ship's commander, which he did not give, but it was Captain, Ferdinand B. Koch, K-O-C-H, was the captain of the John F. Kennedy at the time. So let me show you again the just close up of the map. This is the Bermuda Triangle, and I think probably the ship was near this location here, basically north of the gap between Cuba and Haiti / Dominican Republic. I think probably very likely north of there. I'm going to guess they probably went through the gap there, and most likely is where they encountered this thing. This is about, it's an interesting area of a lot of UFO, USO activity takes place. It's not far from the Bahamas as well. Lots going on there. So let me go into this. So this witness, he said he was responsible for a lot of communications. He's monitoring, he said, 8 teletypes in the communication center. He said 4 would receive messages on various frequencies, and then a separate set of 4 would retrieve messages on other frequencies. And this is important because, as you'll see, the frequencies, everything gets messed up here in the communications. He also said he had a job where he had to alert facilities control whenever a hit, as he put it, was detected, so that they could tune their receivers accordingly, like a communications hit, I suppose. And then lastly, he mentioned NavCom OpNet, that ship-to-shore communications, that shared a teletype both for receiving and sending messages. And he said there's also a circuit for ship-to-ship communication. So it's very complicated. 1971, but there's some very advanced communications going on with the USS John F. Kennedy, even over 50 years ago. So here we are, July 2nd, 1971. It's 8:30 p.m. It's getting kind of dark. The ship had just finished, he said, a long 18-hour flight operations period. Remember, they're doing all of this testing and qualifications. So he was in the communications center when he noticed that the main teletypes were printing out nonsensical messages. So he checked the alternate teletypes. He said those were also producing gibberish. He walks over to the intercom and he informed facilities control that all the broadcasts were down. And then there's a voice that replied. He said that all communications had been affected. So then he looked toward NavCom OpNet and he saw that their operator was also having issues. And then additionally, he heard that the task group operator told the watch officer that his circuit was also malfunctioning. So in the corner of the compartment, he said, was an intercom to communicate with the signal bridge. And over this intercom, he heard someone yelling, "It is God. It's the end of the world." And a moment later, he and his colleagues heard another voice yelling, "There's something hovering over the ship." And this is kind of what I think he was looking at. He goes out, he looks up into the night sky, and he and his colleagues, he's with one or two other individuals, they see a large glowing sphere, he said roughly the size of a beach ball held at arm's length. That's really big. You know, you just visualize that. So there was no sound coming from this thing. It gave off, he said, a warm light. He said about half the strength of what sunlight would be. It pulsated. This is a sphere. It pulsated slowly from yellow to orange and then back again with each passing second. They were only able to observe this object for about 20 seconds before general quarters sounded. That's battle stations. And the communication officer shouted for them to return to their battle station in the comm center. There wasn't really anything for them to do because all communication lines were down. But that's where they had to go. And then after 20 minutes of that, the teletypes, he said, returned to normal, started producing accurate messages. They remained on general quarters for about an hour, he said. This was important, I thought. He said they did not hear or receive any messages concerning this incident. This huge thing happens. This ball of whatever this is shuts down all communications on a major United States aircraft carrier. And he said, we didn't get any messages about this at all. And then he said he later spoke to a good friend who was in the Combat Information Center, CIC, as a radar operator. And according to the friend, all of the radar screens had been glowing brightly during the time of the event. Very interesting. In addition, this witness also, the writer of this event, spoke to someone that he knew who worked on the navigation bridge. That person informed him that none of the compasses were working. And also that a medic had been called in to sedate one sailor who had been a lookout on the signal bridge, and which caused the writer of this account to wonder if that was the person who had been yelling, "It is God," during the incident. We don't know, but could be. The writer also considered it, he says, kind of ironic. You got 5,000 individuals on board this carrier. He said only a handful of individuals had actually seen this phenomenon. But he actually pointed out, he said, look, we had just completed flight operations just shortly before this. All personnel on the flight deck were below, resting. He said it's also important to note that there's very few locations aboard a carrier where people really can easily be out in the open air. I've not hung out on an active aircraft carrier, but I'm going to take him at his word there. You Navy guys can put your comments on and comment on that. But according to what he could determine, virtually all the electronic components basically ceased to function while this object hovered over the ship. And additionally, he said there were two combat-ready Air Patrol F-4 Phantoms. He said they were ready for launch. They were unable to start during the incident. And then he pointed out there was a rumor. He said 3 or 4 men in trench coats had landed on the carrier. I don't know if this was immediately after or when. And he said they were interviewing those individuals who had seen the phenomenon. This man, he said, the writer was not ever asked for a statement, and he believed or assumed it was because no one knew that he had seen the object. Then he said a few days later, and this was interesting too, as the ship approached Norfolk, the commanding and executive officers spoke to the crew over the closed circuit television system, he said, which they regularly did to issue orders and pass on information. During this particular session, the captain praised them for their performance on their ORE, the exercise, and informed them of their upcoming deployment to the Mediterranean. And then he said, at the end of his speech, he warned them that certain events that take place aboard a naval combatant ship are classified and should not be discussed with anyone without a need to know. And according to the writer of this incident, that was all that was ever officially said regarding this incident. So I think this is a truly extraordinary event. We don't know the exact location of where the USS John F. Kennedy was, but I mean, again, assuming it was in the Bermuda Triangle, southeast of Florida, I think we can assume this puts it past the Atlantic shelf where the waters go really deep. They go down to 15,000 feet after that shelf. In all likelihood, the ship was several hundred miles from the nearest shore, whether that's Florida, whether that's the Bahamas, Cuba, Puerto Rico. And then being out in the middle of the ocean at night, this large, imposing, glowing orange sphere finds a United States aircraft carrier and proceeds to shut all systems down for close to half an hour. Please tell me this isn't a national security crisis, or at least an emergency. You have to ask yourself, what kind of aerial object is able to hover low over the surface of the ocean hundreds of miles from shore? First of all, I mean, you've got helicopters, but they better be attached pretty closely to an aircraft carrier or some shit that they can land on, because they can't just go out hundreds of miles out there. They're not going to make it back. And to hang out low over the ocean. You know, what's interesting about this case is we don't know where this glowing red thing came from. Did it come from under the surface? We don't know. Did it come down from above? We do not know. We do not know. But obviously, this was an object that could traverse the vast distances of the ocean, probably with no problem. And as if this needed to be said, this was not manufactured by the Americans, and it was not manufactured by the Soviet Union, 1971, the Russians, or any other nation. How could that be? So I have one more incident that I want to share with you. Let me pull this one up. This one takes place in 1991. We're getting a little closer to the 21st century here. It involves a ship called the USS Kirk. And this is a quite interesting event indeed. As you can see, I've got this located, I think this is probably right, off this west coast of lower Central America is probably about right. The writer of this event stated that back in 1991, he was operations and intelligence petty officer on the USS Kirk, designated, I think, FF 1087. And he said their job was conducting drug interdiction along with 3 other naval vessels. And so what he says is, let's see if I got the next slide here for that. This is an image of the Kirk here. You can get a good look at it. He says, during our drug interdiction operations, we would sail roughly 350 to 400 nautical miles off the west coast of South America and Central America. He said our 4 ships within the task force would sail about 150 miles apart from one another in a straight line. And basically, he said they would all have their own radar stream that would just slightly capture the land, and the whole task force, they basically just barely would overlap with each other. So they would create this large radar capture of roughly almost 800 nautical miles long. Very interesting, right? So their main mission, he said, was to track and intercept low-flying aircraft, drug carriers coming out of Colombia or Panama or Guatemala. That's what he said. And then on occasion, they would intercept and board sailing vessels as well, which they knew were drug carriers. He said it was like the movie Clear and Present Danger. He said we were in communication with DEA. He went into a lot of detail about this, which we don't need to delve into here. He was an operations specialist, which meant that his primary duties took place within the Combat Information Center, the CIC. So here's a slide of the ship at night. Try to create this as accurately as I could. He said at 0200 hours, so 2 a.m. on December 16th, 1991, he said he was on CIC duty. Things were very quiet, very slow, not much going on. He said, I made my way up to the ship's bridge all lights on the exterior of the ship were out. And he said the only lighting on the bridge was contained dark lighting from radar scopes and navigational devices at the helm. He said on this particular evening, he was having a conversation with a junior officer of the deck who was a good friend of his. And then all of a sudden, and out of nowhere, he says a light flash came from below the water to light up their entire ship. Let me read you his quote. He said, all of a sudden, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, like a huge flash from a camera emanating from the starboard bow sea level upward, was a huge flash of red glowing light, which lit up our entire ship. It only lit up our ship, not the surrounding ocean, just our ship. So that's what it looked like. The ship lights up, and then after just a few seconds, the light vanishes and they're back in darkness again. And I think I have another quote here. He said, it happened so fast that the OOD, the officer of the deck, the navigator, and I were speechless for about 5 seconds, at which time I looked at the OOD and asked him if he just saw that light. He stated yes in a sullen voice. He's not too happy about that. He goes on, he says, I then asked the navigator. He replied yes. I then took the navigator's sound-powered headset and asked the forward and aft lookouts if they had seen the same red flash, to which the forward lookout stated yes. What the hell was that? The aft lookout said yes as well. He said, then I immediately contacted CIC, asked the CIC officer if we had any aircraft or surface ships in our vicinity, to which he said, no, it's clear as a whistle out there. He said, I asked if we had any submarine activity in the area, to which he replied, no. The writer goes on, he says, at this point, I looked at the OOD and asked him if we should wake up the captain. The OOD, he said, sat there stunned for a minute, as did I and everyone else. He said, because he's like, what happened there just did not make any sense. I have another quote here. He says, the flash emanated from the sea directly off our starboard bow, like it was touching our bow, and ascended upward so rapidly, creating the effect of the bright red flash. He said the other weird aspect of this event was that only our ship was lit up within the red flash, not the surrounding sea, but our vessel only. That's pretty interesting indeed. He said the officer of the deck elected not to wake the captain, but they did log the whole incident in the ship's log as an unexplained phenomenon. And the writer just said, up until this point, I did not believe in UFOs or USOs. He's got one more quote I think I've got here. He said, I have no doubt that our ship, steaming along at 12 knots, came right up on a submerged, unidentifiable aircraft, is how he put it. I don't think the aircraft or USO had any idea we were sailing up to them. Well, I don't know. I think that might be debatable, but I mean, if this was their job, they were doing this quite a bit, you'd have to wonder they might have had a clue, but maybe not. He goes on, he says, I think whatever it was took off in a very unplanned and fast manner and wanted to quickly identify us, thus the flash. Maybe he's right. Maybe it was a surprise. You never really know. We don't know about this. He says, I've always felt that the event was extraterrestrial in nature. And by the way, we don't have his name, but he did apparently submit his initials, which were GMV. So that's that statement. Fascinating events, all three of these. I mean, what are some takeaways from just these three events? Well, I would say, first of all, I imagine someone who's a committed skeptic of UFOs can just say, who cares? These are just someone's stories. What does it matter? And it's true, like you can take a position of extreme skepticism on just about anything you like and find your own rationalization for disbelieving something, including these accounts. I personally think that's unwise. And here's the thing. If you get a few stories like these that are just outliers, which don't get corroboration from anywhere else, or if they just stick out like a sore thumb and there are no other accounts like them, that's one thing. But that is not what we are dealing with here. We are dealing with a consistent pattern. I presented only 3 U.S. Navy UFO encounters because, well, I mean, how many can you present all at once? But there are many more of these. I've been collecting military UFO encounters for many years now. And when you examine the encounters themselves, and then you read the declassified material, and then you listen to the many statements about this subject from respected military officers and personnel, well, are we supposed to ignore them because a Pentagon spokesperson says they don't offer enough data integrity? The 3 encounters I presented here did not involve any death or permanent destruction, as far as we could tell. Each of the events seemed to involve an observation by some kind of other, let's just say, of U.S. Navy operations at that time. In the case, the 1971 case of the USS John F. Kennedy, with the glowing, that wasn't the glowing, that was with the large, it was the glowing ball of light. Sorry. I get the impression maybe they stumbled onto something, maybe they stumbled onto something. I'm thinking of the Roosevelt. Sorry, I can get them mixed up. The 1954 with the cigar-shaped objects. Maybe they did. Maybe that's what happened. Maybe that's with all of them. Maybe in one or more of them, the other beings decided to examine the United States naval vessel. And that makes sense to me as well. And probably in at least one of the incidents, I would bet it was a deliberate act, intentional observation, but it could be all 3 of them. The thing is, if you think that these are fake stories, you have to ask yourself, why do so many ex-Navy personnel tell them? I've spoken off the record with more than a few of them, and they've shared UFO stories with me. I mean, some were very dramatic, some were maybe not as dramatic, but they were still strange. These people were not making those stories up, not in my opinion, when I spoke to them. And the only thing you could say against some of these stories, perhaps, maybe that, maybe they misinterpreted something that can be conventionally explained. But I don't know. When you examine their actual testimony, it seems to me very difficult to explain these away in some conventional manner. It doesn't seem plausible. And these types of encounters help to explain the secrecy as well, right? Because the military does not have an answer to these things, to these beings, to this technology. These beings, whatever they're operating, they do what they do. And the big, powerful United States military can't seem to do a thing about it. Now, maybe they can and they just choose not to. That's a possibility as well. But the fact is, these things appear to be going on and have been going on for years and years. The UFO field, I'll just say this here as well, I think is in danger of really losing the plot. There's never any shortage of personal feuds, of people still trying to convince you of the latest so-called whistleblower. I'm not saying they're all not legitimate, but I think some of them are not legitimate. Or, some new secret intel that someone's got. They love using that word, intel. I've got intel. Or someone with like the new latest and greatest disclosure prediction. To my astonishment, those are still happening. There's still prominent people out there saying, yes, it's going to happen next month, this year. It just seems to be a never-ending cringe fest in this field that you see these things still going on. And meanwhile, there's an enormous database of events that we should be talking about. We should be analyzing them. And yes, we should be trying to confirm them. But make no mistake, many of them have been confirmed, fully confirmed. The ones I've just presented here have not been confirmed, but I do believe they are worth discussing. They are worth knowing. And in my case, I believe them. I believe them because they fit in with everything else that we're picking up in this field. I mean, hey, we've confirmed the Tic Tac UFO event. That was quite dramatic as well. We've confirmed countless other dramatic UFO encounters with the military. We are being lied to. It's very simple. We are being lied to. Every day on the matter of UFOs, UAP, we are being lied to. Our government has no interest in telling us the truth. It never did. It never did. And I'm telling you, it never will. Trusting them to tell the truth about pretty much anything, certainly about UFOs, I think is always going to leave you disappointed. It doesn't mean we can't ever break through to the truth. I believe we can. But do not put your faith in the bureaucracy of the Pentagon or of the national security state. Truth is their kryptonite. Well, that's all for me at this time. I do thank you for being here with me. I look forward to being with you the next time. Please consider supporting me. You know what to do. Subscribe to my channel, turn on notifications, give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. You can also visit my website over at richarddolanmembers.com if you want more content just like this. That's all. Thanks for being here with me. Let's keep fighting the good fight. Later.